A woman stands at a podium in the year 2000, holding a medal that was earned 40 years earlier by a man who is not in the room to receive it. She is his daughter. The medal is the Prisoner of War Medal. Beside it, in the same small box, sit the Distinguished Flying Cross and the National Defense Service Medal. 3 decorations, 40 years overdue, for a mission that very nearly cost him everything, and did eventually cost him the one thing an institution owes the people it sends into danger: the benefit of the doubt. He has been dead for 23 years. He never heard his own name read out in that room. Hold 2 numbers while I tell you this story. 23. 40. The first is how many missions American U-2 pilots had flown into the most dangerous airspace on Earth before this one went wrong. The second is how many years it took his own government to admit he'd done nothing wrong. You'll want both by the end. And there's a third thing worth watching for underneath them. Not just what happened to Francis Gary Powers, but what happened to the men who spent those 40 years insisting he'd betrayed them. Their story doesn't end the way you'd expect, either. Here's what should disturb you before we even start. Nothing changed between 1962, when he came home to suspicion, and 2000, when the CIA finally admitted the record had supported him the entire time. No new evidence surfaced, no lost document was found. The truth was exactly as available in 1962 as it was in 2000. The only thing that changed was that everyone who needed to keep believing the alternative had finally stopped being in the room. To understand how a man ends up waiting 4 decades for his own government to say 4 words, you have to go back to a cockpit 70,000 feet above the Soviet Union on a spring morning in 1960. The assumption built into that cockpit was that he wouldn't survive. The U-2 spy plane wasn't built to fight. It was built to be unreachable. A single engine, glider-thin wings, and airframes so light it could climb past where any Soviet interceptor or missile was supposed to be able to touch it. That assumption had already cost lives before it ever touched Powers. 3 American pilots had already died testing and flying this same aircraft in the years before his flight. Men whose names never made headlines, absorbed quietly into a program that treated the risk as the price of an intelligence edge nobody wanted to give up. 23 missions into Soviet airspace on the strength of that vet. Powers is about to fly the 24th. There's a detail worth carrying with you through everything that follows. Sewn into his flight suit is a poison pill hidden inside a modified silver dollar. Nobody has ordered him to use it under any specific circumstance. What he decides to do with it or not do in the actual moment is going to become, for people who were never anywhere near that altitude, the entire measure of the man. Remember that pill. It's going to define the next 40 years of his life more than the mission itself does. Near Sverdlovsk, a surface-to-air missile detonates behind the aircraft. Not a direct hit, close enough. The shock wave tears the tail section apart, and a plane built for altitude and invisibility, never for combat, starts coming apart around him in the thin, freezing air. He doesn't eject in the conventional sense. The cockpit design at this altitude risks taking his legs off on the way out. He fights free of the disintegrating airframe manually. His parachute opens at a height that should kill him from oxygen deprivation alone, if the timing goes even slightly wrong. It doesn't. He lands alive in a field outside Sverdlovsk, surrounded within minutes by Soviet farmers who just watched a piece of American technology fall out of their sky. Washington doesn't know yet that he's alive. For 4 days, the official story is a weather plane that's strayed off course, a cover story that's existed, fully drafted, for years, built on one premise. If this ever went wrong, the pilot wouldn't be around to contradict it. Powers is around to contradict it. Khrushchev sits on the truth exactly as long as it benefits him. Then he stands in front of the Supreme Soviet with the wreckage recovered, the pilot recovered, and detonates the American cover story in front of the world, not just catching the U.S. spying, but catching it lying about the spying, on the record, in real time. Every American official who repeated the weather plane line on camera is now, publicly, a liar or a fool. Neither version was one they chose for themselves. The story simply wasn't built to survive a living witness. Now, watch what happens next, because this is where the shape of the rest of his life gets decided, not in the sky, in a courtroom. Powers stands trial in Moscow that August. Theater from the first hour. Prosecutors, cameras, a packed gallery. The Soviets extracting maximum value from an American spy captured in the middle of an U.S. election year. The wreckage sits reassembled nearby, close enough to make the point without saying it. He's questioned for hours, the mission, the equipment, the intelligence objectives, and does exactly what his briefing prepared him for. Confirms what the wreckage already proves, gives up nothing beyond it. Here's the part his critics back home will spend years choosing not to remember. Asked, under hostile foreign questioning, whether he regrets the mission, he doesn't perform contrition and he doesn't perform defiance either. He answers the way a man answers when he's decided the only thing he controls in that room is whether he tells the truth. Western reporters watching the broadcast describe him as calm, precise, giving the prosecution nothing beyond what the facts already force him to concede. 10 years, 3 in prison, the rest in a labor camp. He serves not quite 2 of them before an exchange is arranged, and it's worth stopping on this scene specifically, because it's the one moment in this entire story staged as pure Cold War theater instead of institutional silence. February 1962, the Glienicke Bridge, connecting American West Berlin to Soviet East Germany, a narrow steel span that will later earn the name Bridge of Spies for exactly this reason. Before dawn in freezing fog, Powers is walked to one end. Rudolf Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer held for years in an American prison, stands at the other. Neither man crosses until both governments confirm, simultaneously, by radio, that the trade is proceeding exactly as negotiated. 2 men standing at opposite ends of a bridge while people they'll never meet decide the precise second they're allowed to walk. They cross. Powers is home. Picture what coming home should look like for a man who did everything asked of him, followed the plan, survived an exit his own aircraft wasn't designed to make survivable, gave a hostile government nothing beyond what the wreckage already told them, waited nearly 2 years in a Soviet prison for his own country to negotiate his release, and came straight back the moment it did, rather than defect, rather than stay. That is not the homecoming he gets. The questions start immediately, and they don't come from Moscow. Why hadn't he used the pill? Why had he let himself be taken alive? Why had he cooperated with Soviet interrogators to whatever extent he had? A Senate Armed Services Subcommittee opens hearings into his personal conduct. Stay in this room for a second, because it's where the institution's real priorities show themselves. Senators press him repeatedly on the pill, not on why the agency's own cover story assumed, as a planning premise, that his pilot wouldn't live to contradict it, but on him personally having chosen to end his own life rather than be captured. He answers the same question as many times as it's asked: the missile, the disintegrating airframe, the manual exit, the landing, and the immediate capture by farmers who reached him before any decision about that pill was realistically his to make. Not once in the published record does a senator ask why the agency's own cover story assumed as a planning premise that his pilot wouldn't live to contradict it. He's cleared. No evidence of disloyalty, no evidence he gave up anything of value, no evidence of the cooperation his critics assumed. On paper, the record is unambiguous. But here's the second thing worth watching for, the one I asked you to hold on to at the start. What happens to the men who spent this hearing convinced he'd betrayed them? Nothing. Not one senator on that committee is ever asked to answer for the accusation once the record clears him. No retraction, no correction printed with the same prominence as the original suspicion. The doubt gets a headline. The clearing gets a footnote. A hearing room clearing your name on paper is not the same as the people who doubted you actually believing it. That gap follows him for the rest of his working life. The CIA doesn't return him to flight status. Lockheed offers him a test pilot job instead, a softer landing than most men in his position get, but still a landing outside the agency that sent him up there. Newspapers run the word coward in headlines built for circulation, not accuracy, next to photographs of a man who flew higher and faster over hostile territory than almost anyone alive. Nobody printing that word had been at 70,000 feet with a missile detonating behind them. Powers spends the next decade and a half quietly rebuilding a reputation the agency never fully handed back. Testifies before Congress more than once, walking the same facts through again, as if repetition might finish what the original hearing didn't. Writes his own account because the version circulating in newspapers bears less resemblance to the transcript every year it goes uncorrected. Eventually takes a job flying traffic reports for a Los Angeles TV station, a helicopter and a city grid instead of Soviet airspace, and almost deliberately unglamorous second act for a man who once carried some of the most sensitive intelligence technology in the Western world over the most dangerous airspace on Earth. He dies in 1977 in a helicopter crash covering a wildfire. No connection to Sverdlovsk, to Moscow, to the pill he never used. An ordinary accident ending a life that had already survived the extraordinary version of nearly dying once. He doesn't live to see what comes next. That takes another 23 years. The declassified record, once fully assembled, says what nobody in that 1962 hearing room was willing to say out loud. Powers did exactly what he was supposed to do. He gave up nothing the Soviets hadn't already recovered from the wreckage. The entire architecture of suspicion built around him was never built on evidence. It was built on inconvenience. His survival didn't fit the story his own government had already told the world, and it was simpler, safer, to let the pilot carry the weight of that mistake instead. In 2000, the CIA formally awards Francis Gary Powers the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the National Defense Service Medal, decorations that should have been waiting on the tarmac in February 1962, the day he actually came home. Instead, they wait 40 years, for a room he'll never enter, accepted by a daughter standing where her father should have stood, holding what the institution finally admitted it owed him, long after admitting it cost nothing anymore. Nobody hid the transcripts. Nobody shredded the committee's findings. What took 40 years wasn't new facts. It was institutional willingness, the simple, unglamorous act of a government deciding that admitting it wronged one of its own pilots was finally worth more than continuing to let the silence stand. Institutions rarely fail the people they send into danger through malice. Powers wasn't hunted or framed. He was something quieter and more damning. An inconvenience. A man whose survival didn't fit the plan his own agency built, because doubting the pilot who lived was always going to be simpler than admitting the plan was only ever designed to work if he didn't. That's the pattern this channel exists to find, again and again. Not the missiles, not the aircraft, not the dates half remembered from a textbook. The people underneath them, the ones institutions use, then quietly leave to carry the cost of the institution's own miscalculations. Real sources, no invented quotes, no comfortable version of the past. If this made you sit with how long 40 years actually is, long enough for a man to grow old and die waiting for 4 words his own country could have said the week he came home, that's not an accident. Subscribe if you want the next one found before it disappears for good, the same way this one very nearly did.